Hey guys, welcome back to the next episode of Untuck Your Cross. My name is Dennis, and today I will be sharing my testimony. I think if you guys are hopefully wanting to follow me on this journey as I work on this channel, I think the most important thing, especially when I'm trying to do it as a Christian podcast, would be for me to share my testimony, which is not the easiest thing. It's definitely a scary thing, putting all of that out there on the internet, not knowing who's going to see that, whether or not that's people I know or just random people, and just, you know, what their thoughts are, what their judgments are sometimes. That can all be scary, but I think that the more honest I can be with you guys, the better. I guess the appropriate beginning would be to talk about exactly where my relationship with Christ started. I've been raised in a Christian home my entire life. My parents are both immigrants from Ukraine who became Orthodox after the Soviet Union fell apart, and missionaries from America were able to set up churches. So my entire family was Orthodox. My sister was baptized Orthodox, I believe, but me and my brother were born in Ireland. We didn't get baptized at that point. My dad didn't think that being baptized as a kid was scripturally right. He didn't think that we were old enough to make the decision whether or not we wanted to give our lives to Christ, and he didn't want to make that decision for us, but he still wanted for him and my mom to be raising us in a Christian home. So, in the hopes that we would make that decision when we were old enough and understood what that decision meant and understood the whole cost and the weight of that decision. And so, for most of my life, I've been raised in values of Christianity, and we attended church. Sometimes it'd be periods of times that we wouldn't go to church, but for the most part, we were going to church, especially when I first moved to Canada through Montreal. We were going to a church every Sunday, and then when we moved to Alberta, we started going to a church as well. We found one for a couple years, and it was towards around middle school where we just stopped going, and that was because of bunch of different factors. Things at home were starting to get rocky, and then also just it was hard to balance out work for my parents and my sister's job when she was in high school, and to be able to go to church as well because we just had one car. So we just kind of stopped going to church as a family at that point. In regards to what I knew about God and what I knew about Christ, my dad, he was very much in the understanding that it was important for me to be able to understand the proof of why Christianity was the right belief, why the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, why that God was the right God, and it wasn't a law, or it wasn't the Jewish understanding of a God that they didn't believe in Jesus Christ being part of that Godhead. It wasn't Buddha. He wanted us to make, in his opinion, and I understood it as well, was that the most logically correct belief was the one of Jesus Christ. And so with that conclusion, a lot of my childhood was us watching debates between Christian philosophers and Christian scientists, as well as presenting backups of evidence on why science and Christianity do go together and why atheism isn't a reliable belief, why the Big Bang by itself could not have happened. Stuff like that is what I was really based on, where it's like Christianity is the most logical belief and cause of the universe. And so in that being the truth, then I need to also understand that God had rules that he wanted us to follow. And so the whole 10 commandments was a big thing that me and my siblings had to follow. And so, not praying to idols, but as a kid, that's not really something that you have to worry about, especially when you're raised in a specific religion, like you're going to be following that religion whether you want to or not. And then making sure that you obey your parents, don't dishonor your parents. That obviously was a very big one. Not stealing, not lying, not being sexually immoral. All of those were things that were heavily repeated, and as they should be. But I think what I was missing in what I was learning as a kid was the importance of a relationship with Christ. That was not very much communicated by my parents growing up. I knew that Jesus died for my sins. Why he had to was kind of mentioned. Like, I understood the whole story of Adam and Eve and how they chose to sin. How that exactly affected me was not exactly clear. But one of the main things that was also repeated to me in my childhood was the fear of God, and how important it was to be fearful of him, because God is able to will punish sinners. And so that's why we have to follow the 10 commandments, which can be definitely scary as a kid, where it's like if I go against my parents, God is going to get mad and punish me. And that was kind of like my whole belief system, was that I believed that God was real. I believed this specific God was real. And if I didn't listen to my parents and I did all these other things like lying and stealing, that he was going to punish me, which can be very confusing and very intense for a kid, especially when I did really believe that God existed, but that whole personal relationship wasn't there. And it also resulted in me believing in like a workspace salvation, that the better I was as a Christian, the more obedient I was to my parents, the more obedient I was to God, then the more blessings, more favor, the happier he was. That's how I went to heaven, was by being as perfect as a Christian as I could in my parents' eyes and then in God's eyes. And so that was like my foundation, was that logically I believe that there was a God, and logically I believe that Jesus Christ was the true God. Again, there was a huge disconnect between that relationship, and that wasn't really something that was communicated. And the fact that no matter how close I tried to stay following those laws, those 10 commandments and the rules that God set out in the Bible, I didn't know that didn't get me anywhere closer to heaven and eternal life. I didn't really know about that. And then it was around high school when my parents went through a divorce. Or around the beginning of high school was also COVID. COVID-19 happened. So there was a lot of time on my hands making new friends. A lot of them I met through the football team. And then I also became friends with some people that were older than me that I'd known of in middle school, but I just wasn't friends with them until high school. And it was through those friends that I started dabbling in weed and marijuana. And so much of COVID was me developing this addiction to weed, but obviously I didn't view it as an addiction at the time. I want to go deeper into that story and my battle with addiction in a later episode, but that's just some background of where I was at. And so yeah, going into high school, although I always believed in God, it was not a priority in my life. And me doing all these things like drinking, smoking, and that was both also nicotine and marijuana, where a lot of high school students do that. Doesn't excuse it, but that's where I was at, especially during COVID when there's nothing to do. I think a lot of people started developing those addictions, and I wasn't special. Like, I fell into that, and you can say that it was peer pressure, but I wouldn't say it was peer pressure because like I wanted to do it. Yeah, I think I just had a lot of negative, I don't know, thoughts and just things I just wanted to kind of forget and numb out, and all those vices were a great way to do that. And so God wasn't a priority in my life in regards to that. I would still pray to him when low points would hit, but that was about it. I was also jumping between relationships during high school as well, and the main thing that I was looking for in every girl was that at the very least that in the possible future would want to raise kids, like our kids, in Christian values. That didn't mean that they had to specifically be Christian and believed in God or be baptized or anything. And so it left this weird dynamic where I was like, hey, a lot of people in today's age don't have to be religious, but they've been raised in Christian values because those are like the good morals and good values. So it doesn't really mean that much. And so I was jumping between relationships, sometimes thinking about going to church. Maybe I could go to church with whoever I was dating at the moment, but everything that we were doing together, I just knew that if I went to church, I would feel guilty about what I was doing with my partner at the time, and I just didn't want to do that. It wasn't worth it, even though I felt like I knew going to church was the right thing to do. I just didn't want to feel the condemnation of my actions that I was doing with that partner and maybe feel like I had to break up with them. That wasn't worth that sacrifice at that time. A lot of my high school and university as well was jumping between relationships to relationships, finding my value in those relationships. I think because of my parents' broken marriage, a lot of my value came in how good of a father I can be. That all my value was from there. How good of a father I can be, the type of father that I had hoped to have, and then also how good of a husband I could be. That was my goal in life, was to be better than what I got. That's a weird thing to say because I don't want to seem like I'm tearing down my dad, but the reality was that's where my mind space was at. I was just trying to be the best father and best husband, and if I could be that, then everything was going to go well in life, and that's where my value was. And so the logical first step was, can I be like the best boyfriend? Can I make that girlfriend's family and friends and siblings all like me and just kind of reinforce that I'm a good person, I'm a good boyfriend? Not a great or healthy way of finding your value, because that's all attached to somebody else. As much as you can hope, and definitely that I hoped that I could have an effect on how people saw me, like you have no control over that. And that's such an unstable ground to put all your value in. And so every breakup left me heartbroken, making me feel like I was worth nothing, that I wasn't good enough to be a boyfriend or a husband or a dad. My value kept on being taken from me and just like thrown out. And the way that I would deal with that and cope with that was in more vices that I had, and then also in finding a new girlfriend. And so there was very few times where there would be more than a month between relationships, because that was the only way I felt secure about myself. And this is all leading up to the last relationship that I was in before I gave my life to Christ. It was in a relationship where I believed I couldn't be better as a boyfriend. And in saying that, I know that that's not true. But in my mind at the time, I was like, I can't do anything else to be a better boyfriend. I did have that struggle with my addictions, and that did have effect on a lot of relationships. But in my head, I was like, if I can be the best boyfriend and my only issue is that like I smoke weed, I feel like that's fair to, like, that's not that big of a deal. Like there's way bigger issues with other people, so they can accept that part, like we can both be happy. And so the last relationship, I thought it was going to go all the way leading towards marriage, and there was a point where we would say to each other that we loved each other unconditionally. I can't say what she really felt, but on my end, I really did believe I loved her unconditionally. And this was kind of like the breaking point, and that what led me to finding Christ was that feeling. I'm a huge believer that you can't really love somebody, let alone unconditionally. And I don't think really anybody can do that, especially as a human. I think only God can love you unconditionally. The reason why I'm saying that is because to love somebody truly, I think you need to know every reason why not to love that person. And then you can make a decision whether or not you want to love that person. I think a lot of relationships at the very beginning and during honeymoon phases, you try to paint this better version of yourself. And I definitely did that. And then you start seeing those curtains and those colors fade and be like, hey, what happened? It's like, oh, I just stopped painting this better version of myself, and actually my true self. I didn't change. I'm just not trying to be somebody else now. And once you find those reasons to not love that person, then you can make that decision whether you want to. Until then, it's like you don't really love that person because you don't know all of those bad things that they're trying to hide. They don't have to be bad, but they're just hiding a part of themselves. So you can't really love that person if you don't love those things as well. It got to a point where we broke up, and that left me very much in a broken place, where we would be telling each other that, we could be going the whole way, talking about kids and telling each other that we loved each other unconditionally and that there was nobody else in this world that we were ever going to need or want. And then that not coming to fruition, that was really painful. And so that ended up me spiraling more deeper into the vices that I had. That was me going to clubs more than I had ever in my life, trying to find validation in women, in one night stands, leaving feelings hurt for a lot of girls that I was honestly using just to forget about the pain that I was in. That and like my vices. It was 2-3 months into this like cycle and like dark rabbit hole that I was going into, that I think there was just one night after the club, or one night where I decided not to go to the club, and I was high, and I think I was just crying out to God. Why is it that I can love her unconditionally but she didn't love me unconditionally? Like, why is that? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, how is that possible? I couldn't have done anything better to deserve that unconditional love from her. And then what seemed like an audible voice, or maybe just like a very sharp thought in my head that wasn't my own thought, just like spoke to me like an idea, or just it's hard to explain. What it said was what I believe, and I truly believe was God speaking to me in that moment, was as I'm crying out, I loved her unconditionally, why doesn't she love me unconditionally? And God said, you've been doing that your entire life to me. And something after that just completely clicked, and I was just like, I'm like looking at myself like, what am I doing? I need to stop this cycle of pain of going between relationship to relationship, using these drugs to essentially just fill a hole that none of them were filling for longer than a couple hours. What I understood was God was saying was that he'd always loved me unconditionally, and I never really understood what that meant, and not at that time either. The love that I was seeking, he had that for me, but I only loved him conditionally. I was only acknowledging him in those low points. Hey, so unfortunately my phone died, and that means I lost maybe about 10 to 15 minutes of me ranting. So it's really unfortunate. The enemy's trying to stop this. Or maybe God just wants me to say something else. I don't know. I'm just gonna repeat from where I last cut off. Essentially, I was talking about the moment that I felt like God spoke to me. Yeah, so I was crying out, asking why this girl wouldn't love me unconditionally when I loved her unconditionally, and what else I could do. And then God spoke to me and He said, "You've been doing that your entire life to me." And I understood that as in, He's always loved me unconditionally. That's never changed or will change. But I wasn't loving Him that way either. I was only loving Him conditionally. I was only showing Him love and praise when I was at my lowest, when things weren't going out the way I wanted to be, when I was in valley seasons of my life. That's when I would cry out to God, "Please help me with this." And then the second life is going well, He would be like an afterthought. And once I realized that that's what I was complaining about, this past relationship was exactly what I was doing to God, who does love me unconditionally. It made me be able to forgive that person for not feeling the same, whether or not she needed to be forgiven in the moment. Obviously, I felt like she had wronged me for doing that because I realized how much God loved me and how guilty I felt for doing that to Him and getting mad at her for doing that same thing to me. It just clicked, and I just realized that I need to be focusing on something else. I need to be focusing on God now. Me jumping from relationship to relationship and being hurt and being back at that same exact spot that I was before. Like, I needed to get out of that carousel of pain that I was just kept on jumping onto, and how all these vices that I was going to, how all these women I was pursuing, all this clubbing that I was doing, that it was leaving me empty at the end of the night. Yeah, I just needed to change something if I wanted to get anywhere in my life, if I wanted to be fulfilled. And it was around that time when my best friend had started asking me to go to church. I think originally I was hesitant. I might have said once or twice, I said no. Then I started going, and then I just never stopped going, besides, the odd occasion day of not being able to get there health wise or whatnot. But it became the one thing that I was looking forward to at the end of the week, and just falling in love with God more and more after every sermon. And then my buddy, the same friend, started inviting me to a Bible study, a men's Bible study, and I said no a couple times as well. I was like, I don't want to give God another day out of my week. Sunday's good, I'm falling in love with Him and realizing how much He loves me, but one day is good. Like, I don't want to be like that super religious guy, but I was like, hey, I'll go. I started going. Most boring Bible study that we were doing it on Ezekiel. I was just counting the minutes down to when I was able to go home, and I just came there for the free food and for the prayers at the very end, not really knowing how I can contribute to this Bible study. I had no clue what they were talking about. But then I started opening up and asking them questions. They would kind of talk past something, and I was like, hey, can we circle back to that? Like, I don't understand that. What does that mean? And that environment of me being able to ask questions, yeah, maybe dumb questions or obvious questions, that environment of never feeling like I was doing something wrong or feeling like I was wrong or dumb to ask those questions, it's pushed me to fall in love with God even more. That these guys were showing that image that I was seeking, that image of God that I was falling in love with. Like, they were showing colors of that. And then my pastor as well, he was also very open to my questions. And so it was just an environment where it just felt like nobody was hiding anything. It didn't seem as culty as some people would like to say church is. And yeah, and so I think I just kept falling in love with God more and more, realizing at one point just how broken I am and my brokenness and my sinful nature, and how I always try to be like this really nice guy, and I thought that was enough for me to go to heaven, and just to realize how broken I am and how all these good actions that I'm doing really amount to nothing, and that all these good actions are only because God works through me and that they're not even my own. I just realized how much I needed a savior. I was like, I don't want my sins to finally be counted up and I have to pay the bill, and that Jesus loved me enough to pay for that bill. It was just, and finally when I got baptized in May, a couple months after I started going to church and really understood what the importance of a relationship with Jesus was, and it's not just about following rules. It was the most important decision in my life, and the most fulfilled I've ever felt as well. And that feeling of fulfillment is something that will always stay, because that perfect work that was done on the cross by Christ is everlasting. There's nothing that can be added to that or subtracted. And so I find peace in that. I find peace that he won that battle against sin, that there's something to look for after this life, after all this painful world that we have to go through. I just became very thankful for everything that was leading up to that point where I met Christ. All that pain, all those valleys that I hit, all those doors that I felt like were closed, and all those things that God let me do that wasn't in his will. The way I acted in relationships, the vices that I was struggling with, all those things were not according to his will, but he let those happen because he knew that it would eventually lead me to him. Once I realized that they weren't helping me fill that hole that was inside of me, that Jesus-shaped hole, a hole that can only be filled with the love of God. So my message, I guess, is just that, one, don't be ashamed of your testimony, because obviously I would have wished that maybe my testimony was a little bit cleaner. It'd be a lot easier to post it on the internet if I didn't have to struggle about like addictions and have to bring up past relationships into it. All those things make it really a lot harder to post. But this is just me being my honest self, and maybe my testimony can help at least one person make that step into making that commitment and putting their life into Jesus' hands. And also just, I think the most important thing, like a lot of people, when they think about Christianity, they focus on like this religion. But my main advice would be just to seek a relationship with God, seek a relationship with his son. Just find out how much this God, this perfect man, loved me. Just figure out whether or not that's the love that you would want for yourself. And the more that you learn about that love, it's very hard not to respond to that love with love. Once you realize that he paid that debt even when we were still sinners, you're just more thankful for it every single day, that somebody loved you that much. Somebody so perfect would, pick up your tab on your sin, a tab that you were never going to be able to pay on your own. And I thought that I could for the longest time if I followed those 10 commandments and I said, sorry, God, enough times. But those good works and those sorries were never going to be enough. I was always going to be short of God's glory, and that's the price to get into heaven, and I wasn't going to meet it. But somebody paid my debt. Somebody bought me my ticket, and that was God. That was by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to pay for my debt. That's how I'm able to have that ticket to go into heaven and have an eternal relationship with Jesus Christ. I think that sums up my testimony in a kind of general way. I think there's a couple specific parts that I want to go deeper into, especially with my fight with addiction, what that was like before I knew God and what that was like since I've known God, and my journey in battle with that. I think that in itself is a testimony that I think a lot of people will be able to just learn something, and I think it's a common struggle that a lot of people my age have, especially in university post-COVID. A lot of people have developed addictions, and I'm one of those people, and I was able to fight and and continue fighting with the help of God. And so I think that will close off this episode. Thank you so much for listening to my testimony, my rant. I just hope that one thing was able to draw you a little bit closer to Christ, maybe pique your interest, and just realize that people who claim to be Christian are not people who have like perfect backgrounds or pretending to be holier than thou. Me being a Christian just makes me somebody who realizes his brokenness a little bit more than the average person who isn't a Christian. And some Christians also don't recognize that brokenness. But I think the more that you go into scripture and you read the word and you find out about this perfect man who is Jesus, who is God in flesh, it makes it a clear picture in the mirror and how dirty that mirror is. And you trying to make that mirror clean is that sanctification process of you trying to be more like Christ. You trying to reflect his image closer every single day. And so now I recognize how dirty that mirror is. And I'm doing everything I can to make that mirror a little bit more cleaner every day. And some days I make it more dirty. And some days I don't do anything. But I think my overall heart posture is in a way that's trying to make that mirror more clean. A heart posture that's seeking God's face and relationship with his son, Jesus Christ. So that'll be the end of this episode. Thank you again for listening. I hope to see you on the next episode. Until then, stay blessed and stay bold.